Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're navigating a fascinating and I think really crucial comparison that comes directly from the source material you sent over.
Mhm.
We're looking at two fundamental paths. Paths forged under, well, intense historical and societal pressure.
Right.
The assimilated African, let's call them the AA, and the culturally conscious African, the CCA.
And these are not just academic labels. They represent two very profound and often conflicting strategies for navigating a world that's still, deeply shaped by colonization.
Exactly.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward, but the stakes are high. We're going to do a detailed analysis of these two identities, their psychological roots, their behaviors, the real costs.
And most critically,
Most critically, we'll explore the strategic framework that the sources propose to unite them. This isn't just theory. The goal is creating a joint defense, a shield against threats aimed right at the future of the African child.
okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because what the sources show is that this division, this kind of internal split, is exhausting on its own. But it becomes completely futile when you're facing a massive external threat. This is so much more than a preference for, language or fashion.
Oh, absolutely.
This is about survival, it's about deep psychology, and it's about how this radical self-reclamation becomes a necessary path for healing, sure, but also for strategic resistance.
Precisely. And
Yeah.
to get why there's this call for unity, we first have to really understand the division. So let's start with the core definitions, just as the sources lay them out.
Okay.
The fundamental difference is really in the response to external cultural pressure, be it Western, Persian, Iranian, Indian, Arab norms, you name it.
So let's start with the assimilated African, the AA. The research finds this person either consciously or unconsciously sheds traditional African traits. We're talking languages, communal values,
All of it.
all in favor of adopting the norms of the dominant culture they're in. And the motivation here is, well, it's pretty clear, it's adaptation.
A perceived need for survival.
Right. For getting ahead, for social mobility, or just for avoiding the daily grind of discrimination. It's a pragmatic strategy, but as we'll see, a very expensive one.
And in sharp contrast, you have the culturally conscious African, the CCA. This person maintains or, and this is key, deliberately reclaims indigenous African worldviews and practices.
So their identity is anchored somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. It's anchored in principles like collective responsibility, spiritual balance, ancestral continuity. It's an active step away from that intense individualism that often defines Western paradigms.
So the CCA's choice is, it's an act of resistance, both intellectual and cultural.
It is. Now, the psychological cost of these choices is where it gets really interesting. The sources describe the AA identity as operating under a dual consciousness.
This sounds a lot like W.E.B. Du Bois, the idea of seeing yourself through the lens of the dominant white gaze.
That's the exact framework. And this dual awareness isn't passive. It actively manifests as code switching.
And just think about the energy that takes. To constantly monitor and modify your language, your mannerisms, even your hair, depending on the room you're in.
It's invisible emotional labor, a huge mental tax you pay every single day just to feel safe or be taken seriously.
It sounds like an incredibly expensive way to live. So how does the CCA perspective even begin to address that kind of fragmentation?
Well, what's fascinating is that the CCA perspective tries to bypass it completely. It relies on African humanism, specifically the principle of Ubuntu.
I am because we are.
I am because we are. Personhood emerges directly from your connection to community. It promotes this internal harmony between body, mind, and spirit. It's a deliberate resistance to that colonial demand that you sacrifice your culture for acceptance.
So the anchor is internal and communal, not external and conditional.
You've got it. And you can see these differences play out in those external cultural markers the source provided. I mean, look at aesthetic expression.
Right. The AA might adopt Western dress, corporate hairstyles, to conform in professional settings.
While the CCA often chooses traditional attire, natural hair, ancestral naming. These are very public affirmations of pride.
They're sovereign acts. They resist the whole idea that African markers have to be hidden for you to be successful.
And this goes all the way to their relationship with institutional power. The research found the AA tend to accommodate dominant expectations. Sometimes it's what the source calls aggressive assimilation.
What does that mean exactly? Aggressive assimilation.
It means actively trying to mirror whiteness,
Yeah.
not just in appearance, but by sometimes distancing themselves from their own communities to gain acceptance or protect their professional status.
Wow. Whereas the CCA deliberately preserves indigenous markers, language, attire, rituals as an act of sovereignty.
Their intellectual rebellion is grounded in this understanding that reclaiming these values is a direct counter to the Eurocentric construct that defined African identity as, primitive or less than.
That makes the distinction so clear. But okay, let's shift to the consequences. This is where it gets, I think, really interesting and frankly, painful. If both groups are operating on such different premises, how does the research measure the actual psychological toll?
This is where that adaptation strategy reveals its heavy price. The sources call it the double bind. Assimilation might offer short-term safety, maybe opportunity, but the cost is this deep psychological conflict and cultural loss.
The individual is constantly splitting theirself.
Constantly. I think you flagged the Jessica Casimir study on code switching in the notes. It paints such a vivid picture of the sheer exhaustion.
It really does.
Exactly. Her study found that Black individuals who heavily code switch in white spaces experience chronic fatigue, deep self-alienation, and this is crucial, a form of rejection from their own cultural peers.
So they're caught, they're trying to fit into the dominant group, but they're being subtly judged by the group they came from.
It's a lose-lose for your internal peace.
But wait, let me push back on that a bit. If the CCA identity, by refusing to conform, constantly faces systemic marginalization, career ceilings, isn't that a practical trade-off the AA is cleverly avoiding? For immediate survival, how does the source reconcile that?
That's an excellent question. It gets right to the heart of the strategic difference. The research doesn't deny the marginalization the CCA faces at all.
Okay.
However, it posits that while the CCA faces external difficulty, they gain significantly stronger community belonging and personal integrity. Reclaiming that African-centered identity, it serves as genuine, profound psychological healing from generations of colonial trauma.
So the AA pays a price for immediate survival.
And the CCA pays a price for long-term liberation and self-restoration.
So if we synthesize this, assimilation is a survival strategy, an adaptation within an oppressive hierarchy.
Right.
Cultural consciousness, though, is a strategy of resistance. It's focused on liberation.
That's the core distinction. But this is the exact point where the material throws in this massive external wrench, this internal division, this exhausting psychological battle. It's suddenly rendered completely futile when you look at the external reality.
And you're referring to the threat cited in the sources specifically, Project 2025. The material frames that document as this specific systemic risk that forces this need for unity.
This is critical. The sources present Project 2025 as a direct structural effort to erase Black agency, educational opportunity, economic access across generations. This isn't just a policy shift. The argument is that it's a systemic attack.
And the document lists explicit aims.
Very explicit. Weakening the Department of Education, eliminating the diversity and inclusion programs, rolling back federal oversight of racial discrimination, and voter suppression.
So what does this actually mean for the two groups? This threat targets both of them at the same time. It targets the assimilated African who's invested in professional success that relies on institutional fairness.
Exactly. If DEI programs are eliminated, if federal protections vanish, their entire professional investment is undermined.
And it targets the culturally conscious African who is working to preserve identity and historical truth. The attack on truth-telling in schools, the rollback of historical curricula that directly attacks their work.
The policies attack the very foundation of both advancement and self-definition. So division is no longer sustainable. It's a luxury they can't afford.
Which brings us to the strategic response proposed in the material. Cultural reconciliation activism, a hybrid strategy rooted in Pan-African solidarity.
And the unifying framework is powerful and clear. Protect the African child.
But the sources are very specific that this definition has to go beyond just biology.
It must. The child must be defined spiritually as well, representing the future of a dignified Africa, one that maintains its moral and cultural inheritance. And this goal, it requires blending the strengths of both groups.
Okay, let's get specific about those complementary strengths. The sources detail how the assimilated African, the lawyer, the policy analyst, brings institutional access, policy literacy, strategic communication skills.
They can use their proximity to power, to monitor, to lobby, to negotiate.
While the culturally conscious African, the grassroots organizer, the historian, the artist, they bring the moral clarity, the ancestral grounding, the strength for community mobilization. They remind the movement why it's fighting.
And together, these two skill sets, the institutional and the cultural, they form what the source calls a complete defense system.
The sources outline some concrete action points. One key proposal is a Pan-African Child Defense Alliance, modeled partly on organizations like the TES Child Fund Africa. What would that coalition actually do?
First and foremost, monitoring. The alliance would have to actively monitor education and child protection rollbacks at state and federal levels, then lobby aggressively for equity clauses in budgets. It's about using the AA's policy expertise to protect the CCA's community base.
They also heavily emphasize reclaiming education. Since the sources flag this attack on truth-telling in schools, both groups must co-create curricula. Curricula centered on African excellence in resistance history.
Exactly. The CCA leads the content, providing the foundational truth. The AA then leverages their institutional influence to embed these decolonized programs into existing educational frameworks. It makes the resistance functional within the system.
And finally, developing a unified advocacy language. Using existing legal frameworks, sure, but elevating the narrative.
The communication has to frame these reforms as moral and cultural imperatives, not just political demands, using African proverbs, liberation theology, expressing a resilience that is culturally grounded.
This brings us to, I think, the most profound part of the analysis. We've detailed the division and the threat, but now we have to address the root cause of the division itself.
I really want to spend time on this concept because the sources identify it as the core issue. Menticide.
Menticide. That is a truly terrifying word. It implies a kind of systematic psychological warfare. What does the research define it as specifically?
The term comes from the psychologist Joost Meerloo. It's the systematic destruction of a person's mind, their hope, their capacity for self-determination through ideological control.
So, in this context,
it manifests as the internalized belief that African values, systems, and identities are inherently inferior. Menticide is what created that colonial split between the educated elite, the AA, and the cultural guardian, the CCA, and it's what allowed it to endure.
It's self-hatred, but internalized on a mass scale.
Exactly. Which means the ultimate strategic goal isn't just policy, it's psychological deprogramming to reverse menticide's effects. The sources propose this detailed three-phase action plan for reconstruction.
Okay, phase 1, mental deprogramming.
It begins with a consciousness campaign. The mind is sacred. This would be a mass awareness effort designed to show how thought control manifests in media, in education, even in religious institutions.
And a crucial element here is creating community-based healing circles.
Yes, using narrative therapy for what they call mental re-Africanization. It's a space where people can externalize historical trauma and collectively reclaim memory and self-worth.
That includes practical steps too, like media detox weeks, encouraging people to put down the dominant narratives and engage with African literature, like studying Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind to consciously unlearn that dependency.
Then you move to phase 2, reconstruction. This is all about building the infrastructure for self-definition. So, developing decolonized learning hubs that teach African philosophy and Pan-African history, not as academic subjects, but as tools.
Vital tools of self-repair and mental fortification.
And that has to be paired with this ancestral memory project, which is about documenting proverbs, cosmologies, healing systems directly from elders. This creates a hybrid knowledge base, one that blends ancestral wisdom with modern competence.
So it validates the African mind as a source of innovation.
Precisely. And the final phase, intergenerational continuity, brings the two sides together for the future. It's all about empowering youth leadership networks.
I really like this part. It means pairing an assimilated professional, a lawyer, a scientist, someone with institutional access, with a culturally conscious mentor, an artist, a historian.
To raise balanced new leaders, you create a generation that is both competent in navigating dominant structures and grounded in ancestral wisdom.
So in essence, the whole plan is designed to eradicate menticide's two main symptoms, self-rejection and disunity.
And the AA and CCA must co-lead this movement because they're both products of the same oppressive historical forces.
If we synthesize all this, the plan is basically saying that the African mind must become the central fortress for liberation. The strategic unity transforms what was a crippling internal division from a weakness into a comprehensive defense system.
The path forward is cultural reconciliation activism. The assimilated African uses their proximity to power to open doors. The culturally conscious African reminds the movement and the world why those doors must be opened for the soul of the African child and the continuity of African wisdom.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, in your own context? If the goal here is to eradicate menticide's two symptoms, self-rejection and disunity, what role does radical self-knowledge play in your own professional and personal life? Think about how embracing ancestral wisdom, rather than seeing it as separate from modern competence, could fundamentally transform what professional success even means. The plan posits that the African mind must become the central fortress for liberation. What steps can you take today to fortify your own consciousness?